Malika stood quietly near Gate C2 at Nambozi International Airport. She wore a simple but beautiful kaitinge dress, her posture calm, her eyes kind. She wasn't flashy, just graceful, the kind of woman who didn't need to speak loudly to be noticed. As she checked her boarding pass again, a man nearby, dressed in a shiny blazer and designer shoes, glanced at her from head to toe. He smirked and said loud enough for others to hear, "I think you're lost, economy is that way." A few people chuckled. Malika didn't respond. She just smiled politely and looked away. But inside her heart tightened. Not because of what he said, but because it wasn't the first time. People often looked at her dark skin, her traditional clothes, her quiet nature, and assumed she didn't belong. What the man didn't know was that her ticket was first class. What he didn't see was the invitation from the Tanzanian president's wife tucked inside her bag. And what he would never understand, not yet, was that the woman he just mocked was on her way to speak at one of Africa's biggest business summits. But Malika? She didn't need to explain herself. The man's name was Chisilo, though Malika didn't know that yet. All she knew was that he was laughing loud and sharp, the kind of laugh meant to embarrass, not amuse. He was sitting with his friend just a few seats away in the waiting area, and his voice carried across the room like he wanted everyone to hear. "She's probably trying to sneak into business class for the free snacks," he joked, nodding toward Malika without even lowering his voice. His friend burst into laughter. A few others around them chuckled, not because it was funny, but because people often laugh when they're unsure of what else to do. Malika heard every word. Her ears burned. She clenched her jaw tightly, her fingers wrapping around the handle of her small suitcase. But she didn't say a thing. Not because she didn't have words. Oh, she had many. But because she had learned long ago that silence could speak louder than shouting. She stared ahead, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Her heart, however, wasn't quiet. It pounded with memories. So many times people had looked at her and decided who she was before hearing her name. Because she was quiet. Because she wore traditional clothes. Because she didn't walk around trying to prove anything. They saw a poor village girl. Someone who didn't belong. But what Chisilo didn't know was that Malika had worked for everything she had. That she used to sew clothes in a small stall at Luando Market, working from sunrise to sunset. That one of her dresses had gone viral after a tourist wore it in Paris. That her life changed, but her humility never did. And now she was invited to speak at one of the most powerful business summits in Africa, sitting here with a first-class ticket in her bag. Still, she said nothing, because she knew something Chisilo didn't. Sometimes you don't need to clap back. You just need to board your flight and let your arrival speak for you. What Chisilo didn't know, what almost no one at the airport knew, was that Malika wasn't just some quiet village girl in a colorful dress. She wasn't there by mistake. She wasn't lost. And she definitely didn't need to sneak into business class for free snacks. In fact, the ticket she held in her hand wasn't just for business class. It was for first class, fully paid for and personally arranged by the First Lady of Tanzania. Yes, the president's wife had invited her as an honored guest to the Pan-African Women in Business Summit happening in Kigali. Malika had come a long way from the dusty corners of Luando Market, where she once stitched dresses by hand under a leaking roof. She used to sit on a wooden stool with sore fingers and a hopeful heart, dreaming that her designs would one day matter. And one day they did. A tourist bought one of her dresses and wore it to a fashion event in Paris. The photo went viral. Orders started coming in. Her Instagram blew up. Journalists started asking for interviews. And little by little she rose. Not because she begged for a seat, but because she built one for herself with every stitch and struggle. So when she got the call from the Tanzanian First Lady's office, she almost dropped the phone. They told her she had been selected as one of Africa's emerging women leaders in business. She was to speak on the main panel. Her hotel, her flight, her security, everything would be taken care of. It was more than she had ever imagined, and yet it felt like she had earned every second of it. Now, standing at Gate C2, holding her elegant woven handbag in silent pride, she could feel the judgment in the air. But she didn't need to explain anything. She didn't owe anyone a story. Let them laugh. Let them guess. Let them wonder. Because soon enough the whole airport, and maybe even Chisilo himself, would see who she really was. And by then it would be too late for apologies. As Malika moved closer to the boarding area, dragging her small suitcase behind her, She could feel the eyes. Not just from Chisilo and his friend but from strangers in line. It was subtle at first, a glance, a whisper, a raised eyebrow. But then even the security guard at the first-class line paused as she approached. He looked at her traditional kaitenj dress, the calm way she walked, and the soft smile on her face. Then he stepped forward and asked almost too casually, "Are you sure you're in the right queue?" For a moment, silence wrapped around her like a heavy blanket. The people behind her waited to see how she would respond. Chisilo, just a few steps away, smirked again like he was watching a joke play out. But Malaika didn't frown. She didn't argue. She just looked the guard straight in the eye and smiled gently. "Yes," she said calmly. "Are you?" That one sentence changed the air. The line grew quiet. A few people shifted uncomfortably, suddenly unsure of themselves. There was something about the way she said it, not with pride, not with anger, but with power. A quiet, dignified kind of power that made people rethink their assumptions. Malaika didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her presence said enough. She stepped forward, handed over her boarding pass, and continued on. But in that moment she left something behind. A question in the minds of those who had judged her. Who is she? What they didn't know was that Malaika had been questioned her whole life. At markets, in offices, even by neighbors who didn't understand her dreams. But every time she chose grace over anger. She knew who she was. She didn't need permission to stand in any line. And that day, in that airport, the people around her got a small taste of what it felt like to doubt someone who actually belonged. Someone who would soon take a stage and speak to a continent. They just didn't know it yet. When the boarding call finally came through the speakers, Chisilo stood up quickly, adjusting his blazer like he was about to walk into a photo shoot. He held his silver economy class ticket proudly in one hand, chatting loudly with his friend as they moved toward the gate. He didn't even look behind him. He was sure Malaika would be sitting at the back somewhere, trying to find space near the toilets. But to his surprise, Malaika was just a few steps behind him. Quiet, composed, and still carrying that small suitcase with the hand-woven handle. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't pretending. She simply walked like she belonged because she did. Chisilo reached the gate first. The attendant scanned his ticket, the screen flashed green, and he moved forward into the economy lane. A second later, Malaika stepped up and handed over her phone for scanning. The QR code beeped. Then the screen flashed bright red. For a second, some people turned to look, expecting trouble. But then the words appeared clearly. First class priority boarding. Gasps rippled through the line. A few eyebrows lifted. Someone in the back even whispered, "Wait, what?" The attendant's voice shifted instantly. "Welcome, Madam Tembo. Right this way." She smiled politely and gestured toward the red-carpeted priority lane. Chisilo stopped walking. He turned his head slowly and watched Malaika, the woman he had mocked just minutes ago, glide past him with quiet confidence. No words. No gloating. Just grace. His mouth opened slightly, but he said nothing. It was like the floor had shifted beneath him. People around started to look at her differently now. A few tried to remember what she'd said earlier. Others looked at Chisilo like he'd just tripped over his own pride. But Malaika didn't look back. She didn't need to. That red flash had said it all. Not just a seat upgrade, but a moment of truth. In that single blink of a screen, every insult, every side-eye, every laugh at her expense was read. Just before boarding began, a well-dressed woman in a navy blue suit walked up to Malaika with a bright smile. "Excuse me, Madam Malaika?" she asked kindly. Malaika turned slightly surprised. "Yes." The woman's smile grew warmer. "I'm from the Pan-African Women in Business Summit. I've been assigned to escort you to the premium lounge. Everything has been prepared for your journey." Chisilo, still standing nearby, overheard. He looked over, confused, trying to understand what was happening. But before he could say anything, the woman gently took Malaika's small suitcase and began leading her down a quiet corridor, away from the noise and crowds. When Malaika stepped into the lounge, it felt like entering another world. The lights were soft, the chairs were wide and velvet. Gentle music played in the background. There were fresh flowers on every table and trays of food and drinks that looked like something out of a magazine. A few important-looking people sat reading newspapers or typing on laptops. No one rushed. No one stared. The assistant guided her to a private corner and handed her a folder. "Inside you'll find your full schedule for the summit," she said. Your hotel in Kigali has already been confirmed. A car and security detail will be waiting for you when you land. And one more thing, she smiled proudly. You'll be the main speaker on the first day. Your panel is the highlight of the event. Malika blinked, her eyes stinging slightly. For a moment she just sat there, holding the folder in her lap, feeling the weight of the journey that brought her here. From stitching dresses in the heat of Luando Market to being the guest of honor in a first-class lounge. Outside the glass walls, Chisilo walked past and caught a glimpse of her, sipping hibiscus tea, dressed in that same kaitenj dress, now sitting beside a top UN executive who leaned in to speak with her. He paused, then tried to enter, but the lounge staff stopped him. First class only, sir. As Chisilo walked through the terminal, still thinking about the red flash on the boarding screen, something caught his eye. Through the large glass window of the premium lounge he saw her, the same woman he had mocked earlier. Malika. But this time she looked different, not because of her dress or her posture, but because of the people around her. She was seated comfortably in a deep armchair, sipping hibiscus tea from a fine china cup. And next to her sat a man he instantly recognized from the news, a high-ranking UN executive, casually chatting with her as if they were old friends. Chisilo stopped in his tracks. He stared through the glass, confused, embarrassed, and suddenly very small. The woman he had laughed at was now sitting in a space he wasn't even allowed to enter, with people he'd only seen on TV. Curious, maybe even desperate, he walked over to the lounge entrance. I need to speak to someone inside, he told the staff politely. That lady. I know her. The woman at the desk glanced at his ticket, then shook her head gently. I'm sorry, sir. This lounge is for first-class passengers only. He hesitated. But, I understand, sir, she interrupted, still polite but firm. First class only. Chisilo stepped back, feeling the weight of the moment press against his chest. He stood there awkwardly, pretending to check his phone, but really just watching her from a distance. He could see her smiling, listening, nodding. She belonged here. That much was clear now. Later that night he found her Instagram account and sent her a private message. Hey, about earlier today. I didn't mean to come off rude. I think I've seen you somewhere before. Maybe we can grab a drink while in Kigali. He stared at the screen, waiting for the scene notification to appear. It did, but no reply came. Malika had read the message. She just didn't feel the need to answer. Some lessons don't need to be explained. They're best learned in silence. Just a year ago, Malika was sitting on a small wooden stool in the heart of Luando Market, sewing clothes by hand. Her stall was barely the size of a closet, just a patch of fabric hung up for shade, a rusty sewing machine, and a few colorful dresses hanging on thin wires. Most people passed by without even glancing her way. Some would stop, smile politely, and then move on to the more polished boutiques in town. She was just another market girl to them, quiet, dark-skinned, always wearing simple kaitenj. No makeup, no shiny shoes. Just calloused hands and big dreams. Every day she'd wake before sunrise, sweep the dusty ground, set up her table and get to work. She stitched with love, even when no one noticed. She'd pray silently over each dress, hoping someone would see the beauty in her work. But days went by with no sales. There were times she had to choose between buying new fabric or eating lunch. Then one day everything changed. A tourist from France passing through the market stopped at her stall. She was drawn to one of Malika's boldest designs. A deep red dress with hand-beaded detail and a pattern inspired by Zambian stories. The woman bought it without bargaining, smiled, and promised to wear it at an event in Paris. Malika didn't think much of it after she left. She just hoped the woman would like it. 2 weeks later, her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. The dress had appeared in a fashion photo on social media. A famous stylist had shared it with the caption, "Undiscovered magic from Zambia." In days, her Instagram following exploded. Orders came in from Nigeria, Kenya, France, even New York. She cried when she saw the first international payment arrive. From that tiny stall, her world had shifted. People who once ignored her now lined up. News reporters called. Magazines asked for interviews. But through it all, Malika stayed grounded. She had carried the weight of judgment her whole life, but now she was learning how to fly. As fate would have it, when they boarded Flight 707 to Kigali, Chisilo and Malika ended up in the same row, but with very different experiences. Chisilo was in seat 17B, a tight economy seat with little legroom and a window that barely opened enough to lean on. Malika, however, was directly across the aisle, but behind a soft, velvet curtain that separated economy from first class. Her seat reclined all the way back, came with a footrest, and had a personal screen twice the size of his. Chisilo couldn't believe it. After everything at the gate, after being turned away from the lounge, he thought at least he'd be far from her. But now she was right there, close enough to hear but far enough to remind him of the difference. Every now and then he peeked through the curtain, pretending to adjust his seatbelt or look for the flight attendant. But really he was trying to get a glimpse of her. Malika relaxed in her spacious seat, reading a magazine and sipping juice from a real glass, not a plastic cup like his. She didn't look at him. Not once. And that made it even harder for him to sit still. He felt like a schoolboy who had teased the smartest girl in class, only to realize she was the guest of honor. He kept fidgeting, glancing over, hoping maybe she'd catch his eye and smile, or give him a chance to say something. But Malika was too focused on her piece. She had waited too long and worked too hard for this moment. She wasn't going to waste it on people who only saw her worth after the world clapped for her. The curtain between them wasn't just fabric. It was a symbol of where she was and where he was not. And as the plane took off, with Malika's seat gliding back into comfort and Chisilo stuck between a crying baby and a man eating loudly, the message was clear. Not all journeys start in the same row, and not all people arrive at their destination the same way. About halfway through the flight to Kigali, the plane hit unexpected turbulence. The lights flickered slightly, the seatbelt sign blinked on, and the cabin jolted just enough to make a few passengers gasp. One elderly woman in business class clutched the armrests and began to breathe heavily, clearly frightened. Her hands trembled, and she kept looking around as if searching for someone to comfort her. Without hesitation, Malika unwrapped the soft scarf from around her neck, a beautiful piece she had designed herself, and gently placed it over the woman's shoulders. "It's okay," she said softly, her voice calm and warm. "We're safe. Just breathe with me." She held the woman's hand, whispering soothing words in Swahili and smiling gently. The woman slowly began to relax. A flight attendant nearby, who had been watching quietly, leaned closer to Chisilo, who was still awkwardly seated just across the aisle. "You know who that is, right?" she whispered, glancing toward Malika. Chisilo shook his head slowly. "No. Who?" The attendant raised her eyebrows, almost surprised. "That's Malika Tembo, the fashion mogul from Zambia. She's speaking at the Pan-African Women in Business Summit. I read about her. Her designs are on runways in Paris now. She's a big deal." Chisilo's eyes widened. He turned to look at her again, truly look at her this time. Not through judgment or pride but through realization. The same woman he had laughed at, the one he thought didn't belong, was not only seated in first class, she was also the kind of woman who stayed kind and gentle, even when no one was watching. The kind of woman who helped someone else during a storm, even though she'd walked through many of her own. For the first time, Chisilo felt small in the right way. Not because of her success but because of her grace. And as the plane steadied in the air again, he quietly looked down, unsure if he'd ever be brave enough to say what was now sitting heavy on his heart. IW. When Flight 707 finally landed at Kigali International Airport, the passengers stood and stretched, waiting for the doors to open. Chisilo shuffled in the aisle, still trying to act casual, though his mind had been spinning since the flight. He stole one last glance toward first class, where Malika calmly gathered her things. No rush, no show, just quiet elegance. As they exited the plane and walked through the tunnel, everything changed. Outside the gate, a crowd had gathered. Not passengers but media, photographers, and airport security. Flashing cameras lit up the terminal, and a few uniformed officers stepped forward to clear a path. At first, Chisilo thought maybe a celebrity or politician was arriving, but then he saw the driver holding a large white placard that read in bold, elegant letters, "Malika Tembo, Guest of Honor." His heart dropped. Malika stepped forward, still dressed in her kitenge dress, but now with a quiet power that seemed to part the crowd around her. A woman from the summit team rushed forward with a huge bouquet of fresh roses. Another assistant bowed slightly and whispered something in her ear. Photographers clicked nonstop as they captured her every move. Then came the moment that sealed everything. A sleek black SUV with tinted windows pulled up, the flag of the Pan-African Summit waving on the hood. The driver opened the door for her with deep respect. As she stepped in, a police escort arrived to lead the way. Chisilo stood off to the side, his mouth slightly open, suitcase forgotten in his hand. Everything about her presence felt royal, but it wasn't fame or fashion that stunned him. It was how calmly she carried it. No drama, no revenge, no arrogance. Just purpose. She didn't even glance in his direction. She didn't have to. And as the convoy pulled away, Chisilo remained frozen, realizing too late that the woman he once mocked wasn't just boarding a flight, she was landing in her destiny. That night, after settling into his budget hotel room in Kigali, Chisilo lay on the bed scrolling through his phone, his mind still stuck on everything that had happened. The red flash at the gate, the lounge he couldn't enter, the scarf moment on the plane, the cameras, the flowers, the convoy, and most of all Malaika. He couldn't stop thinking about her. Not just because she had turned out to be famous or powerful or successful, but because she had handled everything with such grace. No bitterness, no arrogance, no need to prove anything. She had every reason to clap back at him, but she didn't. That silence was louder than any words. Curious, maybe even desperate, he typed her name into Instagram. Her profile popped up immediately: Malaika Tembo, fashion mogul, speaker, founder of Tembo Threads. Her page was filled with vibrant designs, beautiful quotes, photos from Paris and Lagos runways, and now a few behind-the-scenes snaps from the Kigali summit. She had over 300,000 followers. He hesitated, thumb hovering over the message button. Then finally he typed, "Hey, about earlier. I didn't mean to come off rude. You looked familiar. Maybe we can catch a drink while in Kigali." He pressed send. A few seconds later, he saw the dreaded seen notification pop up. And then nothing. No reply. No emoji. No typing bubble. Just silence. He stared at the screen, hoping maybe she was just busy. Maybe she'd write back later. Maybe she'd say yes. But deep down he knew the truth. Malaika didn't need to respond. Not to him. Not to anyone who had judged her too quickly. Her silence now wasn't anger, it was boundaries. It was dignity. It was a quiet way of saying, you don't get access to me now just because you finally saw my worth. And as Chisilo placed his phone face down on the bedside table, the weight of her silence spoke louder than any message she could have typed. The next day, the grand hall at the Pan-African Women in Business Summit was packed. Journalists, diplomats, CEOs, and young entrepreneurs from across the continent filled every seat. Cameras were everywhere. Bright lights beamed down on the stage, and a soft buzz of excitement filled the air as the announcer introduced the next speaker. And now, the host said, please welcome our guest of honor, Malaika Tembo. The lights shifted. All eyes turned to the stage. Malaika stepped out in a stunning cobalt blue dress, hand-stitched with delicate Maasai beadwork that shimmered under the lights. Her hair was wrapped in a matching headscarf, her posture straight, her steps calm and steady. The room went silent, not out of politeness but out of awe. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to perform. Her presence alone was powerful. She stood at the podium, smiled gently, and began. My name is Malaika Tembo. A year ago, I was sewing dresses in a market stall. Today, I stand here not because I'm the loudest voice, but because I learned the strength of staying grounded, even when the world tries to bury you. Her topic, the power of silence in a world that underestimates women. She spoke of moments when people looked down on her, when they assumed she didn't belong, when they laughed before knowing her name. She shared how silence isn't weakness, it's wisdom. How sometimes you don't need to argue with small minds, you just keep building, keep rising, and let your work speak for itself. People leaned in, listening closely. Her voice was soft, but her message was bold. She spoke for every woman who had been overlooked, every girl who had been told she wasn't enough, every dreamer hiding behind a sewing machine or a simple uniform. And when she finished, the entire hall stood up, clapping, cheering, some even wiping away tears. Chisilo, who had managed to sneak into the live stream on his phone, just sat in silence. Now everyone could see what he failed. It was the end of the summit, and the airport in Kigali buzzed with activity. Malaika walked gracefully through the terminal, her luggage gliding beside her, and a soft melody playing in her earbuds. She looked refreshed, calm, the kind of peace that comes after being seen, heard, and celebrated for who you truly are. As she approached the gate for her return flight, a voice behind her made her pause. "Hi, Malika." She turned slowly. It was Chisilo again, standing just a few steps behind her, his face softer than before. No mocking smile this time. No smug glances. Just a man who had been humbled by the truth. "I hope you'll forgive me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, she just looked at him, not with anger, but with a quiet, thoughtful calm. Then she smiled gently, the way someone smiles when they've already moved on. "I already did," she replied. "A long time ago." He looked slightly relieved, until she added, kindly but firmly, "But forgiveness doesn't erase accountability. You'll have to unlearn your reflex to disrespect women who look like me. Women in traditional dresses, women with quiet strength, women who don't fit your idea of success." Chisilo opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. She wasn't cruel. She wasn't angry. She was just clear. Her boarding pass scan read again, "First class." The attendant smiled and gestured her through. As she walked down the jet bridge, her back straight, head held high, Chisilo remained behind, holding his economy ticket in his hand like a reminder. A voice on the speaker called, "Final boarding for Flight 707. And just like that, she was gone. This time he didn't feel mocked. He didn't feel rejected. He felt educated. Because sometimes, the lesson isn't in a loud clapback, it's in a calm truth. And sometimes the last thing you hear from someone isn't just a response, it's a mirror. And that mirror? It was clear, powerful, and wore a chitinge dress. When Malika returned home to Luando, the small dusty roads that once carried only whispers of dreams now echoed with excitement. Word had spread not just that she had been on TV, not just that she sat beside presidents and CEOs, but that she came back. Not to show off, not to boast, but to build. She walked through the old market where her journey began, the same place where people used to walk past her tiny sewing stall like she was invisible. Now young girls rushed to meet her, eyes wide with hope, hearts full of questions. They didn't just see a fashion icon. They saw someone who looked like them, spoke like them, and made it out there. But Malika wasn't interested in being a star. She was interested in planting stars. With the help of her team, she cleared out the back of her old stall and transformed it into a warm, welcoming space. Clean benches, sewing machines, books, mirrors, vision boards. She called it boarding pass to purpose. It wasn't just about fashion. It was about reminding every girl who stepped in that she belonged in any room, whether it was a market, a boardroom, or first class. Malika taught them not just how to stitch fabric, but how to stitch confidence. How to carry themselves with grace even when the world doubts them. How to never let anyone's smirk decide their worth. Her legacy didn't fit in her luggage. It lived in every girl who walked away from that little space in Luando, standing taller,